أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to viewers and listeners. This is study number 7 of the Ramadan Daily Quran studies for the year 2020. I am Zahid Aziz of the Ahmadi Anjuman Ishat Islam, Lahore, UK. As I said at the end of the last study, the first 6 studies are specifically about fasting in Ramadan. And after that, every year in the daily Quran studies, I move to other topics mentioned in the Quran. So this year, we'll begin looking at what the Holy Quran says in Surah Al-Baqarah, it's chapter 2, about the Bani Israel, the Israelites, or the Jews, and what they were taught through Musa, through Moses, Hazrat Musa, and their prophets, and how they failed to act on those things. And the reason why the Holy Quran goes into those details or relates that story is as a warning that Muslims would also deviate from Islam in the same sort of way. So in Surah Baqarah, chapter 2 of the Holy Quran, immediately after the story of the appearance of man and woman on earth and the mention of Adam or Adam, the Bani Israel, the Israelites, are addressed and they are reminded of the fundamental points of the religion taught to them through their prophets. So the verse 40 of chapter 2 says, Ya Bani Israel, azkuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum wa afu bi'akhdi ufi bi'akhdikum wa iyaya farhabun. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. This translates as, O children of Israel, call to mind my favor. Bring to your mind, in other words, recall my favor. My means Allah's. My favor which I bestowed on you, and fulfill your covenant made with me. That is to say, your promise made with me. I shall fulfill my covenant made with you, and me alone should you fear. The me here, of course, is Allah speaking. Now the covenant or the promise made with God, this promise are the duties which a person commits himself to perform. That the Israelites said, we will obey God in carrying out these commandments. And Muslims say the same, that we are Muslims, we carry out, we commit ourselves, we promise, we've made this promise with God to carry out His commands. So that is the covenant made with me, which is called Ahdi in this verse. And then there's the promise God made to people, the covenant made with you, which is called Ahdekum, the promise God has given to people. And they are the promises that if you fulfill your side of the covenant by remaining true to God's commandments, then you will succeed and prosper in the world, materially and spiritually. So where it says, if you fulfill your covenant you made with me, I shall fulfill the covenant I made with you. If they fulfilled their side of the bargain by adhering to that guidance, God would then fulfill his promise to make them successful materially and spiritually and a great nation in the world. This is meant, in fact, as a reminder for Muslims who are subject to the same principle that applied to the Israelites before them. And that principle is that God will only grant them success if they fulfill the duties which they have agreed to carry out as Muslims. Now, these duties must be done fearing God alone, as stated in this verse, and me alone should you fear. If religious obligations are carried out from fear of other people, fear of society, fear of religious leaders, fear of the government, then that means that those duties, religious duties, are only done for show and not out of belief. So their performance does not create faith or conviction in the heart. And the moment that person is out of reach of the authorities, or if those authorities lose their power, the moment that happens, then such a person doing it for show or for fear or out of fear, that person stops doing that duty because he was not doing it out of belief and faith. So the question then arises, does God make people act on his guidance through fear of God? We mentioned fear of people, but does God make people act on his guidance through his own fear, as is commonly said? Now, fear is a natural human instinct, a human and an animal instinct. It can be used by a dictator or a criminal to terrify people into submission. On the other hand, all kinds of organizations, as well as the legal system of a country, they use fear to warn people of the dangers of doing something which is harmful to them or to others. And once you realize that those things are harmful to you, you don't need to be made afraid by some agency like the police, because you realize that those things are harmful. And God employs fear for this purpose also. And once you realize that they are harmful for you, you are not afraid of God in that sense, that you are only doing it or refraining from those things out of fear and not out of understanding. Now, when this verse says, me and me alone should you fear, by fear of God in this verse is meant fear of a breakdown of your relationship with God. And these words, and me alone should you fear, mean that you should have a greater fear of the breakdown of your relationship with God, a greater fear of breakdown of that relationship than your relationship with anyone else. Fear of God does not mean that God is a terrifying being that you want to run away from them, that you want to run away from, and whose very mention terrifies you. That is not the fear of God meant in Islam, that God himself is such a being that you want to run away from him because he terrifies you. And the moment you approach him, you can't, it's unpredictable what mood he will be in, and he might punish you. So that is not the conception of the fear of God in Islam. Now, another point to be noted is that throughout the Holy Quran, it says something like 15 times that those who obey God's guidance, they shall have no fear, nor shall they grieve. And in fact, just before the verse that I've been dealing with here, just two verses before this, it is stated as a general principle, فَإِمَّا يَأْتِيَنَّكُم مِّنِّي هُدًى فَمَن تَبِعَ هُدَايَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. That it is the law instituted by God that whoever follows my guidance, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. This clearly gives us to understand that a person who continues to follow God's guidance reaches a stage where he has no fear that he might be on the wrong path. And looking back, he has no regret that he followed that path. So he is now completely certain that he is on the right path. He's got no fear that I might have made a mistake and gone on the wrong path. And he doesn't regret, he doesn't grieve having followed that path. So this is the stage where he realizes that the duties required by God are a source of nourishment for him that keep him alive. So they lose the fear that they might be on the wrong path, but they still have, the fear they still do have is of drifting away from that path, because they are sure that they are actually on the right path, so they are afraid of drifting away from it. Now, an objection is raised generally against religion that religious preachers, clerics, and Maulvis keep people trapped in religion by making them fear God's punishment, sometimes even for small acts of deviating from the religion. They tell you that God's punishment will befall you. Now, what we must remember is that the teaching of the Quran is that we should fear only God. So we should not become afraid by listening to this kind of speech from preachers and Maulvis, because they are not God. The speaker is not God. That speaker whose speech you are listening to, who's making you afraid of God as a terrible being. So anything such a preacher says must be checked, must be tested by what God has actually revealed. And in the Quran, God says, Allah says that He is the most merciful of those who show mercy, and that He forgives sins altogether. And even in these verses, which I'll be dealing with, from verse 40 to verse 74 of chapter 2 of the Holy Quran, which go through the history of the Israelites, the Bani Israel, the Jews, and mention again and again how they went against the commandments of God. Even in these very verses, God's mercy and forgiveness for them is mentioned many times. In verse 52, it says, Allah says, then we pardoned you after that so that you might give thanks. And in verse 54, it says, so He turned to you mercifully. Surely He is the one who turns to mercy again and again, and He is the merciful. In verse 58, it says, and make petition for forgiveness. We will forgive you your wrongs. So every time they went wrong and violated God's commands, He told them that if you repent, then God will turn to them mercifully. So what fearing God alone means is, first of all, fearing no one in the world. And this is what leads to a person's moral elevation, when he fears no one in the world. A person who sticks to his principles, regardless of fear of anyone, he is actually in fact fearing God alone, even though he might not recognize it, he might not be religious, he might not believe in God. But if he sticks to his principles, regardless of fear of anything in the world, then he is fearing God alone. And in this world, all progress and reform of any kind that has been brought about by people who feared nothing, but the only thing which they feared was that their own shortcomings or mistakes may hamper their cause. That was their fear, that they might not live up to their cause, they might make mistakes and damage their own cause. That was the only thing they were afraid of. And this is the same as fearing nothing. This is like fearing nothing except that one may lose the path to God. So with that, I end study number 7. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.